We are a little late, but I am going to go ahead and call this Metro Flood Diversion Authority special meeting October 17th in order. Could I get approval of the agenda? Motion by Grant, is there a second?
Second.
Second by Rick. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, same sign, and the motion is carried. There's not a roll call on here. Is that a typical North Dakota thing? Roll call?
On
Do you
this one,
usually
you
do-
just vote yes, everybody in favor.
No, I meant like who's-
Attendance.
attendance.
Oh.
I didn't write up the agenda. Should we
Right,
just,
it's a meeting.
I think we should do that because we
Okay.
normally do that. Would you
Okay, take
mind?
the roll. No, not at all.
Okay, thank you.
Ms. Williams,
Here.
Mr. Hendrickson, Mr. Paulson, Mr. Campbell, Mr. Wayland,
Here.
Dr. Mahoney,
Here.
Mr. Pepcorn,
Here.
Mr. Grinberg, Mrs. Sherling. Here. Mr. Peterson.
Here.
Mr. Steen.
Here.
Mr. Dardis.
Here.
Mr. Jacobson.
Here.
Thank you. I'd like to extend a special welcome, especially to General Spellman. We had an opportunity to have some conversations earlier, and it's exciting to kind of have you here in our community to kind of get sort of a real feel one-to-one on what's happening. We're pretty excited about where this is going at this point, and I know you have some decisions that you need to make soon, and we want to do as much as we can to help you with that. And Senator, it's always a pleasure to have you here, so
Thanks, Mary.
welcome. Glad you could come.
Appreciate all you're doing, all your leadership.
Mary?
Well, thank you, and thank you, everyone, for being here, and those in attendance in the audience for showing your interest and support in this project. General, thank you so much for being here. You know, we really appreciate your service, and I just want to compliment your staff. We've gotten to know them over the years, and they've just been, we've formed a great working relationship, and really looking forward to some excellent times ahead of us. So really appreciate all those involved from the Corps. And of course, Senator Hoeven, thank you so much for joining us, and also thank you so much for your hard work on passing the WRDA bill. As many know, the county over the years has purchased a lot of properties using the hazard mitigation funds through FEMA, and those are deed restricted, and this has enabled us to use some land that's very much needed for building on that project. So we really appreciate all your efforts and your continued efforts. Thank you for being here.
Tim?
Again, welcome to our community. General Spellman, I know you're headed to Florida for the disaster down there, and we surely never want a disaster like that with a flood here, so we're very pleased you get to see something before and after, but you're working on the before right now. We're glad to brief you on this. I know we've had a lot of different changes in the Corps as time goes on, but the support of the Corps to this project has been tremendous, and we continue to enjoy that support. Senator Hoeven, I know you've gotten through some hurdles, got the water bill passed for us, got the FEMA things taken care of. All we need you to do now is fund the rest of the project, or I mean fund the core part of the project. So we're looking forward. Yeah, we're looking forward to continue to work on this. But we want to thank your office. You've always been very helpful to us in Washington, and this is another example where we can brief the Corps, bring them up to date, and see what's happening. The General and I were talking just previously to this, and he said he's never seen so much involvement of the local private partnership of the public working so hard with them, and of the local and all the people that have stepped up for this project. So we thank you for that, and we look forward to continued partnership.
Great. I did not also welcome Colonel and Terry and Judy, who's somewhere, and your staff. Oh, there you are. And I was remiss in that. I gotta admit, it feels like you're like part of us. So when you're here, it doesn't feel like, oh my gosh, they're here. But so thank you. I appreciate all your work you've done in this. And on the agenda, we have you for discussing supplemental environmental assessments update for this group, and thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mayor. It's a pleasure to be here always. I think it's been a whole 2 weeks since the last time I was up here, and I hope it's not much longer till next time. But we really do appreciate, I've only been in one district in the Corps, so I can't speak with wide-ranging experience, but I think we have something pretty unique here relationship, the teamwork, the camaraderie, and the common purpose of getting this project done. We know there's still some hurdles to get through, and we're always cognizant of the people that are negatively impacted by the project, yet we know how important it is, and we are committed to fighting through those hurdles, treating people fairly, and getting the project built. In that vein, since February, we've been working on a supplemental EIA, draft supplemental EA, so draft supplemental environmental assessment of the project. And that is what we need to get completed before we can continue and certify that Plan B is going to work. We are pretty confident that it will, but we're working through that. As many of you know, we had a public comment period from the 27th of August through the 27th of September, and on the 13th of September, we had a public meeting over in Moorhead. We have received about 65 separate comments based on that public comment period, and I think the Minnesota DNR, from what we have heard, is working on about 400 comments. Most of the comments that the Corps has received are from the Minnesota DNR, the Buffalo Red Watershed District, the North Dakota State Water Commission, and the Richland and Wilkin County JPAs, so that's where the bulk of those comments are coming from, but others from other places as well. We're working collaboratively with the Diversion Authority, with the Houston Moore Engineering Group, and also with the Minnesota DNR to jointly address those comments, and we will do a thorough job of that. We expect that we will be able to issue our final version of the supplemental EA sometime in winter, probably close to the end of November. And then I'll take a look at that, and if it's clear that a finding of no significant impact is warranted, then we'll be able to approve that environmental assessment and move forward with the plan. There is always a possibility that based on the comments or other review, that we would have to do an EIS at that point. Once that's done, then of course, we hope that concurrently, as we're working through this together, that the Minnesota DNR is able to finalize their supplemental EIS and make a decision on a permit. So we expect still that will all probably come together in December before the end of this year. We're hopeful for that and working to make that happen. I'd be happy to answer any questions, but that's what I have in way of an update.
Any questions for the Colonel?
One question I have is, you said you're doing the EA, you think you'll have it done around when?
The end of November, Senator.
But then you said there's some possibility you might have to do an EIS?
Right, that's just part of the NEPA process, that if you get to the end of an EA and find that there are significant impacts that you hadn't expected or hadn't anticipated, then if a more thorough study is warranted, then we could go in that direction.
Right.
We don't see any sign that that's going to be necessary.
Okay. Then next on our agenda is an update from John Shockley on the public-private partnership. One of the things, a few of us had the opportunity to hear John talk about the P3 at a North Dakota Water meeting and thought that some aspects were particularly interesting. So I think John has incorporated a little bit of this into your update, correct?
Correct.
Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Senator. Thank you, Major General, and thank you, Colonel. As the Chair had indicated, I'd provided a P3, a public-private partnership agreement update to the North Dakota State Water Commission, and I've tried to incorporate some of those comments into a brief slide presentation. It is a fairly complex project, so feel free to interrupt with any questions that you might have. It's interesting. It's an innovative program. It's the first of its kind in the United States, so not only is it of local interest, it's also of national and international interest. Some of the teams that we have retained as potential developers, we'll get into that later, are of international nature. So it's a very interesting and intriguing project from a national standpoint. So the purpose of my presentation today is to give a brief overview and executive summary of the P3 process, and then just kind of an update of where we're at. And the P3 process started before the project partnership agreement was established between the Corps and the local sponsors. And that really codified all of the initial groundwork that had been undertaken between the Corps and the local sponsors. And as you'll all recall, the project partnership agreement was signed on July 11th of 2016. Also part of that approval process was a P3 MOU. That P3 MOU outlined the relationship of the Corps and the local sponsors throughout the P3 project. There was a lot of work and collaboration between the Diversion Authority and the Corps. The Corps has, as the members of the Corps that are here know, the Corps has numerous approval requirements and procedures, and adapting those to work within the P3 world took a lot of collaboration and a lot of thought and consideration on both sides of how we would make that relationship work. And the P3 MOU really outlines how those major approval processes will work. The PPA split the project into two components, the diversion channel and the associated infrastructure. That's in blue. That's the approximately 36-mile diversion channel. Bridges, including rail bridges, county highway bridges, and interstate bridges. That would be undertaken through procurement that would be run by the non-federal sponsors with the collaboration of the United States Army Corps of Engineers using P3 procurement. The southern embankment, and on the map that you'll see, this is the Plan B southern embankment, noted by the change in the western tieback levee, moving that to the west, the change in the southern embankment alignment, most notably on the Minnesota side, moving that from essentially a straight east to west line, and now the southern embankment, once it gets to the Minnesota line, goes directly south. So how does P3, how is that different than a traditional procurement? I'm just going to briefly go through this slide. In a traditional procurement, the public agency, whether it's the United States Army Corps of Engineers or a local political subdivision, they're entering into separate contracts with engineering firms, contractors, and they may or may not perform their own operations and maintenance. And you may ask why the determination to split the project between the diversion channel and the southern embankment. During the drafting of the P3, we had a lot of industry input and a lot of thought and consideration went into that split. The Corps is noted for its ability to construct a very robust flood protection infrastructure, and it was felt that from a allocation of responsibility standpoint that the Corps was best suited to construct the southern embankment due to its engineering experience with levees and control structures, and the diversion channel was a less sophisticated passive water feature, and that would be best suited for the first time to use P3 procurement. In a typical P3 model, that changes where the public agency is contracting with a single P3 developer who is responsible to bring equity into the project, to borrow money, to employ engineers, its own contractors, and its own operations and maintenance. So at the time the Diversion Authority receives a bid, it'll receive both a capital bid and an operations and maintenance bid. And this is unique in the area of public infrastructure because as public entities, we're used to receiving one bid. The school building costs $100 million, and the taxpayers really don't know what the full extent of operations and maintenance will be for the next 30, 50, or 100 years. P3 is really a transparency issue when it comes to procurement. At the time of the bid, the public, the governing body here, will know exactly what the operations and maintenance costs will be for the next 30 years. And that's set by contract between the public agency, here the Diversion Authority, and the successful development. So where are we at in the P3 procurement process for the Diversion Authority? And I thought this was a good slide that we presented to the State Water Commission, kind of illustrates the steps that, the progress that we've made thus far. Early on, prior to the signing of the project partnership agreement, the Corps and the Diversion Authority had numerous meetings with the P3 industry to gather their input about what types of portions of the project were best suited to P3 procurement, what their needs were in regards to the P3 procurement, what they saw as major issues that we had to address. The Corps and the Diversion Authority participated in an industry day where representatives of the industry, both from a traditional contracting standpoint, because the Corps is still constructing the southern embankment using traditional features, to a P3 procurement. They attended an industry day here in Fargo. It was very well attended. And then subsequently, we issued a request for qualifications for the P3 teams. The request for qualifications is really a very in-depth analysis of whether or not the teams that would be proposing on the project are qualified. That includes, are they financially able to complete the project? Do they have the engineering know-how? Do they have the ability to construct this type of a project? Have they constructed similar projects? Have they closed on P3 deals? Those were very in-depth requests for qualifications. The Corps was involved in that process, and those were issued shortly after the PPA was signed. The response by industry was very favorable. For such a large project, we received 6 complete responses, submissions of qualifications. It is my understanding that we would have received 7, but just prior to the deadline for the submittals to be submitted to the Diversion Authority, one of the teams dropped out due to an issue with the equity partner. And it was not for lack of interest, that just timing-wise, they weren't able to recompose that team. So we had 6 teams that responded with submittals. Once again, these were both international and national teams that had constructed multiple projects, very large-scale construction projects around the country. The P3 technical team, which included representatives from the Corps, participated in reviewing those RFQ and scoring those. And subsequently, we shortlisted a total of 4 teams, which ultimately went down to 3, who were chosen to proceed to the next portion of the process, which is to bid against the RFP. Prior to the issuance of the injunction, the Diversion Authority team had been diligently working on the RFP along with the cooperation of the United States Army Corps of Engineers. We had put together a draft RFP that had been submitted to the proposers, the 3 teams, to provide comments, and we were working through those comments and had produced a very good document that was almost ready for bid by the industry. So the big red dot or big red circle indicates where we're at on the process. That has since temporarily been put on hold until we have resolution to the injunction. Assuming that the injunction and the permit are issued, we would then finalize the RFP, submit that to the industry, and then we would envision that one team would be selected as the winning proposer, providing both a capital bid and an operations and maintenance bid for the next 30 years. Under North Dakota law, we're required to have a public hearing. The Diversion Authority would have a public hearing. It's not a veto hearing, it's just to take public comment. Then we would envision approval by the Diversion Board and a commercial and financial close and execution of the P3 agreement, and construction begins. You may ask, what's in the RFP? There's really 3 major components to an RFP. The first is the instructions to the proposers. That is really the rules of the game, so to speak. How do you run your procurement? What communications are permitted? Who is going to speak for the Diversion Authority? The second is the project agreement. The project agreement outlines the relationship that is proposed between the 2 parties, very much like a construction contract. But here, in addition, it's a long-term service agreement because they'll be providing O&M for the project long-term. And then finally, the technical requirements, which are different than what many of you have seen on projects where you have plans and specs. The technical requirements really set the bookends for what's permitted. So a good example is a street. You might, a typical plan set would tell you that you need 6 inches of gravel, 4 inches of base grade, 6 inches of asphalt, whereas in a technical requirements, it would state the lane width, the turning radius, the length, the wear requirements, but it wouldn't get into the specific detail. And instead, it would force the industry into coming up with a proposal, a technical proposal, which is ultimately reviewed as part of their submission to the public entity for approval. So just briefly, what's the P3 highlights? Looking at those highlights, how they work in our project. First and foremost, the public entity in a P3, it's not privatization. The public agency retains ownership and control over the asset, even though some of the responsibilities are transferred to the private sector. So here, for all purposes, all of the infrastructure will continue to be owned by the Diversion Authority. It's not privatization. It's just transferring the risk of operations and maintenance to the developer, which is governed by the project agreement. And that really goes to what's in the project agreement. The Diversion Authority, along with the Corps, have spent a lot of time developing what the standards should be. How is the channel going to be operated? How is it going to be maintained? And the public agency really has control over that. And once again, really, how that relationship is established is set forth in the P3 agreement. Here, the Corps has been very involved in the review and comment regarding the project agreement. So what are some of the advantages? The private sector partner can deliver innovative technical solutions. So for example, if there's a cost-saving way to design bridges as part of this process, the P3 developer can bring that to the Diversion Authority and say, I have a great idea on how to save $500,000 on your bridge design. I would like to implement it. The Diversion Authority still has control over that, and through the P3 MOU, the Corps still has review over that to make sure it complies with health and safety requirements. But it allows the private sector to innovate. Perhaps there's a better way to deliver it. Maybe it's not a technical innovation in the sense of an engineering solution, but maybe it's a construction solution. Maybe the contractor can put all the bridges in first and then dig the channel later. It provides that optimization when you have the contractor and the engineer on the same team. So one of the challenges, and as part of the P3 process for the Corps, we've really tried to look at it as a pilot project for the Corps, or learning. One of the challenges that I have seen is that in P3 you have a convergence of environmental approvals under documentation and innovation. On the one hand, we want the private sector to deliver to us innovative flood protection solutions, but on the other hand, we have a very stringent environmental review process that can require you to design pieces of flood control infrastructure that are so detailed within environmental review documents, it limits your flexibility in the P3 sector. So really trying to figure out how to draft those environmental documents in the future for future P3 projects undertaken by the Corps is really critical so that you can continue to foster that innovation. Some of the other advantages is the engineer and the contractor work collaboratively. So when the engineer and the contractor are on the same side, they're talking instead of just reading a plan set. So oftentimes in a traditional bid-build process, the owner's engineer will put the plans and specs together, put it out for bid, and then the contractor responds. And there's not really that collaboration between the owner's engineer and the contractor, whereas in P3 that puts them on the same team, and so that they can have that conversation, collaborate, and perhaps find a better way to implement the project and lower the construction costs. You might ask, why do they want to lower the construction costs? Because they will be putting a bid together for the public sector. They want to win that bid, so the emphasis and risk is on them to put together a lower cost, more effective bid that's within our technical requirements. One of the other big components, and I continue to go back to this, is the public agency receives a fixed price for a fixed price bid, and the private sector assumes the risk of delay. So under our agreement, our draft agreement, and under most P3 agreements, the developer, also the contractor, will only receive payment if they have the project substantially in place and operational by a certain set date. If they don't receive that, they don't receive their payment. And so they have a tremendous amount of pressure on their team to complete the project on time because they have lenders to answer to, they have equity to answer to. In our project, we had envisioned that there would be some milestone payments during construction, but the majority of the cost of construction for the diversion channel will be paid after it's substantially complete and over a period of 30 years. And so they have an incentive to complete on time and to deliver the asset on time. Some of the other important things to keep in mind about the P3 process is that it's really like an insurance policy that they have to maintain the asset, so they're going to deliver it and they're going to maintain it. And if they don't, we have the ability to set off from payments every year. So the incentive is on them to make sure they're performing it within the guidelines set forth by the Diversion Authority. Whereas in a traditional project, they build it, they hand it off to the public entity, and they walk away. And there's really, after the year warranty period is over, there's not a lot of incentive on the contractor other than reputational injury to make sure that it's operating. The private entity holds debt and is incentivized to deliver the project in order to receive the availability payment. We went through that. Some of the other big issues that are very important in this cost are certainty and schedule. At the time we receive our bid, we will also receive a project schedule that the project agreement will be based upon. It incentivizes innovative design. One that is big for me is it reduces taxpayer costs by identifying both the capital costs and the operations and maintenance costs at the time of bid. And for me, I think that's a very big deal because it's transparency in today's political environment. Transparency with taxpayers is a big deal. And so I really think that P3 offers that ability that you are demonstrating to the public that you know what the operations and maintenance costs will be for that infrastructure. It creates efficiencies that you don't see in other models. They're taking on the risk of financing, they're taking on the risk of delivery, they're taking on the risk of managing the engineer and the contractor. The long-term availability payments act like an insurance policy. If they're not performing according to the agreement, you can set off from their availability payments. If you start setting off amounts from their availability payments, that triggers all kinds of defaults and issues with their lenders and with their equity partners. And so they really have an incentive to stay compliant with the project agreement. Contractor and engineer invested, and it brings private equity to the project. I think one important thing to keep in mind about our particular project is that the administration has noted that they would like to see more projects with a larger proportion of local financing and state financing and a smaller percentage of federal financing so that you can essentially utilize federal financing to build more projects around the country. And I think this is what this project really does, is that we have a lower percentage of federal funding than a lot of projects with the state funding and local funding, and we're able to deliver it in a faster manner. And so I think it's a good model for the future. And with our project, we've been really collaborating with the Corps so that we can use it as a learning tool going forward. And there's been a lot of discussion and a lot of takeaways and debriefs after we've had certain issues come up. We try to meet as a team and say what went right, what went wrong, how can we improve it for the next time that the Corps uses it. And so what's our action items to move forward? We're really working on finalizing the updated costs and a financial plan. The Minnesota permit, you've heard earlier today regarding the environmental, supplemental environmental reviews, both by the state of Minnesota and the United States Army Corps of Engineers. The removal of the injunction based upon hopefully getting a permit. And then we would proceed to re-engage the P3 teams. And we have 3 teams that we shortlisted, and they are still in the process. They are just temporarily on hold. They're not undertaking any action because of the injunction. I can certainly answer any questions that you might have. I tried to shorten the presentation from the presentation I gave at the State Water Commission, but be happy to answer any questions. It's a very exciting project. It's very important for the community, and I think that we can really be a pilot project for the rest of the country and see how P3 can be utilized to deliver flood infrastructure.
Thank you, John. We're actually kind of fortunate that John had sort of the, I mean, he's initially basically my city attorney, but this happens to be one of his strong suits, so we were able to tap him in. Any questions for John?
He's so well-known when he goes to New York, people hunt him down for P3 projects, right, John?
Wouldn't go that far, but
Thank you. Tim?
I would just say Bernie Dardis is the Fargo West mayor, and he was on the task force team that kind of moved us forward, and I thought perhaps, Bernie, you maybe want to say something, and you raised your hand just in time.
First of all, the question I wanted to ask my city attorney also, Mr. Shaw.
He is, yes, that's right, I know that. We were lucky,
We're going to let you
right?
steal all the thunder, Mayor. John, with all of the P3 requirements in the bid process, do you have any type of feel that with these demands, with the schedule and the fixed cost, the cost that this is going to put on the back end? I mean, I've worked in contracts all my life, and, you know, these types of elements normally tend to raise the price. Is there any way to evaluate that?
well, yeah, so the idea is that you are compressing the engineering along with the construction cost. So you're seeing cost savings by having the two parties work on the same team. Under a traditional bid process, you have a set of plans and designs that may be different than how the contractor is going to implement the project. And so what the P3 industry has seen is you generally lower the cost of the bid, and you probably may see an increase in the type of quality because the contractor and the engineer are on the same side. And so it's a different way of doing business for the public sector. It's innovative, and it allows really the capture of that. To your question of does it add costs in the back end, that's really something that's internal to the team itself, how they want to put their bid together, because they're competing against 3 other teams. And so they really have to put pencil to paper to figure out what's the lowest cost that they can deliver the operations and maintenance. And there may be a balance between, for instance, do we use a certain type of riprap that might have to be replaced every 10 years versus a certain type of riprap that might have to be replaced every 30 years. And so there's that balance that they'll have internally, as long as it's within the technical requirements, which in our case have been developed in conjunction with review by the Corps of Engineers, review by our local engineers, review by our PMC, who has brought in internationally recognized P3 engineer, and then along with our local design engineer. And so I think that we have good technical requirements that no matter how they build within those, we'll get a good project, and I think the process itself will drive the bid down.
It's to their benefit that it's built well and efficiently, which is, I think, one of the interesting perspectives which differs from something else.
And one other thing, I know you're all public officials, I know I've been in front of most of you before, and none of you like change orders. That is the goal with P3, is to eliminate the use of change orders. All that risk goes on to the P3 developer.
That's not fair. That's directed right at me, John.
It's not just your board.
I'd have a question, John, on that, along that line. No change order, or change orders are then on the project developer. Almost invariably, when you build something, as you get into it, there's some requirement for a change. And, you know, I mean, you can't anticipate everything. So what happens if city, diversion authority, whomever says, you know, we really do have to have a feature here that maybe wasn't contemplated? How's that handled in the P3 model?
Okay, so two parts to that answer. So the first is for your typical action that would take a change order. Let's say that there's a geotechnical issue there that you didn't expect to encounter, that in a traditional agreement you would like there's a whole bunch of extra rock buried there that we didn't anticipate. In a normal agreement, you'd have a change order, change conditions. In our agreement, we provide them all the data and make the site available. They test it. They take on the risk of issues like geotechnical issues. So they have to price into their bid that this potential possibility that there might be changed conditions. And so they have to go in, they have to be assured, internally they have to be confident that the ground conditions are what they think when they put their bid together. In our project, we actually saw the teams come in during some excavation. We did, I think, 3 or 4 separate test excavations where they evaluated the soil conditions so that they could make sure that they were comfortable in putting a bid in. Now, your second part of your question, Senator, has to deal with what happens if the diversion authority wants a new feature, one that's not contemplated in the agreement. That is a compensation event. So if we, the diversion authority, say we'd really like to add 2 extra bridges, we have to go back and negotiate with the P3 developer. And so in the P3 world, it's really about the due diligence, making sure that we as a diversion authority are satisfied with what we're requesting from the private sector. And that's why there's so much time spent in the beginning of a P3 as opposed to during the construction cycle. And I can say from my experience, having seen both processes, the P3 process is more intensive at the beginning, whereas a traditional project, you really have that scrutiny during construction. And because of that additional scrutiny during the procurement period, a lot of those detail issues are worked out.
Thank you.
Any other questions for John?
Thank you.
Thank you. The next item we have on the agenda is some remarks. Would you like to
Thanks,
start the
Mayor.
honor, Senator?
You bet. It's good to be here and give you an update on some of the legislation that we needed to get passed to help keep the project moving. I was here maybe a month ago. Does that sound about right? And talked about a number of things that we had to get in legislation that are important for the project, for Route B, and for all the different things that have to happen so that we can continue to move forward. So always good to be here with you, not only to give you today a progress report on the legislation that we've passed, but it's really helpful because I get an update on where you're at with the project. It's an incredibly important project. I thought Mayor Mahoney really hit the nail on the head. We're welcoming Major General Spellman here today, and I've had a chance to work with him in a number of different capacities. He was most recently the Northwest Division Commander, Northwest part of the United States Division Commander, and did a great job. And of course, now he's the guy that's in charge of basically civil works for the Corps of Engineers. So he's the right guy to have sitting here between us, believe me. This is the guy that makes sure we build these big projects around the country. And I think Mayor Mahoney hit the nail on the head when he said, okay, General Spellman, you're up here today, and we're working on a vital project to protect, a multi-state project to protect people. And so we're on the, this is the front end, the ounce of prevention, if you will, that prevents the pound of cure. And of course, you're going from here down to Florida, and we've just seen the devastation. Our hearts and our prayers and our help goes out to Floridians who are trying to recover from a real disaster. And make no mistake, when we have a flood, that's a natural disaster, just like a hurricane's a natural disaster. And so we're reminded that we need to keep moving forward, and that the dollars that are spent here by the local communities, the counties, the states, and by the federal government is money that's a permanent solution so that we don't have to spend a lot more after people have suffered real hardship and even devastation and death like we've seen in Florida. So it's a very solemn reminder of how important this work is and why it's challenging to build any big project nowadays, but why we have to continually work to get everybody on board, make it comprehensive, make it work for the region, because it really is about protecting people's lives and their property for the long term, and doing it in a way where they're protected on the front end so we don't have that devastation on the back end. And so You know, I think Mayor bringing that up and General Spellman, I mean, it's very real as you go from here to Florida. It really brings home how important it is we keep moving forward. When I was here last time, we talked about a number of different things that we need to proceed. One, of course, Mary referred to earlier, and that is we're going to have to cross a number of, with Route B now, we're going to have to cross a number of areas, right, that have easements on them because of HMGP, Hazard Mitigation Grant Program money that's been provided by the federal government for flood protections. And so, of course, the upside is that's all help create more flood protection for the region, but that also comes with an easement, which would restrict us from, you know, agreeing to be able to use Route B because of those easements. In the Water Resource Development Act bill, which we just passed now, and now we do have it passed, we have those easements. And so we'll be able to cross those areas, those HMGP buyout areas, without any cost to the project. So no cost to the local communities or to the states. So that was obviously very important as far, well, we needed it. We couldn't have done Route B without it unless we were going to buy back all those easements, which obviously would have been expensive and very difficult to do. So that was a huge step. The other thing is in the energy and water bill, which we've also passed now, there are 3 things in there that we really needed, and that's passed now too. First, the WIFIA legislation, and that essentially is provides low-cost funding or borrowing. Excuse me, I better be careful. Low-cost borrowing authority, so that for the local share, it helps reduce the cost because the federal guarantee gets you a lower financing rate. So that will save very significant cost for the local share. And so essentially what we did is I was able to include in the energy and water appropriations bill, which is done now, language that directs the Corps to stand up WIFIA, which is the Water Infrastructure Finance and Innovation Act. So they have to the Corps actually has to put a program in place. We gave them $6 million just to get the program in place so that by the time you're ready to fund local share, you'll be able to use very low-cost federally guaranteed borrowing, which, like I say, brings down your borrowing costs, and obviously that's huge savings on the local share. So that's one. The second thing in we put these in the energy and water appropriations bill, and I'm on that committee, which was, we wrote the bill, so that's helpful.
Convenient.
Yeah, it works better that way. The second thing is language that OMB wanted. So I thought John did a great job of talking about all the benefits of P3, and not just the benefits for this project, but for the federal government, state and local government as well. But it's new. This is not how the federal government has typically done big, civil works projects around the nation. But it's an innovative, creative solution, which again, in my book, kudos to this region, Fargo, Moorhead, Cass Clay County, all the folks, West Fargo, all the folks that comprise this coalition to get this done for the region in a comprehensive way. Kudos for being creative and stepping up and trying to find solutions. And I think it really is a model for the rest of the country, as I've talked about before. Well, as part of that, we have to change the way the federal government does things. OMB looks at projects and they don't take into account that P3 aspect. And so then when they line up their projects for funding, we don't get credit for that, which is why we have to have, so this is new language that directs OMB to go back and say, no, you have to now set up a new analysis model where you give credit for that P3 benefit, which is a benefit to the federal government as well as to, the projects that we're trying to get done. So that was language actually that OMB wanted, and so we've included that now. And then the other area is funding, and that's, now we're going to come back to our guest of honor today, Major General Spellman. We put an extra $150 million into the construction account for the Corps for this year, so that you, as the #1 guy that oversees that project account, can talk to us about how it's very important the dollars are allocated to this project in your work plan, the Corps of Engineers work plan, and because we've been, haven't had the permit yet because of the, the litigation and so forth, getting the permit from the state of Minnesota, we haven't been able to be included in the budget. Instead, we've had to fund through the work plan. And we made sure that not only did we fund the budget request, we added $150 million above the budget request so that for critically important projects like this one, you would be in a position to make sure that we're in good shape in that work plan. And that's why we're so glad to have you here today, General, knowing your tremendous track record and somebody who gets things done. And I mean that absolutely. It's been great working with you, but you know how important it is for this year's work plan, and that we're counting on you. And that seems like a great time to turn things over to you. Great.
Thanks, sir.
I heard a really strong hint in that.
Sir, I'm going to answer your question. I'm just going to take a minute to get there. Hey, first, I want to thank Mayor Williams, Mayor Mahoney, thank you for the invitation and to come on out today. And sir, it's always great to see you again. So I had, first of all, I apologize for it's taken me so long to get out here. I had this trip planned a few weeks ago, and then Hurricane Florence hit the Carolinas. That deviated a bit, and I actually intended to stay a bit longer on this trip. Our mission set in Florida and Georgia has grown a little bit here over the past couple of days, so I'm going to just take a quick turn and get down to Florida to look after our team there. I had 3 objectives coming out here. 2 of them were long-term, and 1 of them was short-term, which is the Senator's question, which I'm going to get to. First was to really understand what this project was all about and just kind of get a 101 level brief. And I had a meeting this morning with the district team, and I'm about 3 or 4 hours into the Fargo-Moorhead Diversion Project now. I'm no expert, but I'm certainly getting there, and trip was certainly a success on that front. And then just to get at what John talked about, this whole thing about P3. I shared this with the group earlier. So for the Corps of Engineers, we have seen a record level of appropriation from Congress. And I want to thank Senator Hoeven and all the leaders in Congress, and certainly all of Congress for that. So if you go back to July earlier this year, we had the FY18 Energy and Water Bill was passed. It was a record appropriation for the Corps of Engineers, highest appropriation that our agency has ever received. 30 days after that, we had the FY18 storm supplemental, largely to recovery from Harvey, Irma, and Maria last year. But not just those storms. We're not just doing work in Texas and Florida. That bill enabled us to get after long-standing studies and construction work that we need to do in about 33 other states. And that was a bill, that was about $17.4 billion, much more than we saw following Katrina, certainly more than we saw during Superstorm Sandy. Then, of course, we just had, this is the first year in a while where we're not starting off the year on a continuing resolution, which is incredibly valuable for people that have to study and build things. Another record appropriation for the Corps in the FY19 Energy and Water Bill, just under, a hair under $7 billion. That's an incredible amount of trust that the nation and Congress has put in our agency, and we recognize that first we have to deliver, and we've got to deliver faster for communities like yours and others just like it across the nation. It is, I want to assure you, it is not business as usual back in the Corps headquarters. We have a number of initiatives that we are taking to put the spotlight on projects such as this and to get after them quicker. And if I could just hit a few highlights of some of the things that we're talking about. Delegations of authority. We're taking decisions out of with Secretary James' permission, we're getting decisions out of the Pentagon and back to districts where they belong, where they used to reside. And over time, things have been pulled up. We're taking decisions that were made in D.C. in our headquarters, and those are going back out to the regional commands and back to the district so we can turn projects quicker. We're doing a lot of regulation reform. We've had, this is all part of the administration's effort. We've got about 52 regulations on the docket right now. We're going through those to see what can we do away with, what just needs to be amended, or what can stay as is. And we're through about the first 10 of those right now. We're eliminating a lot of process in the Corps, and I'm happy to talk that in more detail. I won't go into much here today, but we had steps in our process that really didn't add value to what we were trying to get after, and to be frank, they were just slowing us down, and we're taking those out. With this level of appropriation, we are exploring, I'll just call it workload sharing concepts that, to be frank, is a bit of a culture change for the Corps of Engineers. What do I mean by that? So if you go down to Jacksonville District today, a lot of construction projects, a lot of studies that they've been tasked to do following the storms of last year, where that district's not going to do that work. That work's going to be done in Kansas City, or that work's going to be done in Rock Island. We'll keep a local face on it down in the region, but the actual work is going to be done someplace else so we can get it done faster and get to construction much, much more quickly. That sounds very common sense. Why haven't you been doing that forever? That's a great question, but this has been culture change for us, and we are moving out on it. I would say that we're going to do a lot of heavy leaning on industry as we go through this. And then finally, this whole thing that John has been talking about, and I've learned a lot just by listening to John this morning, which is really the reason I wanted to get here, was to understand a little bit more about P3. So unless you're in this district and working on this project in the Corps of Engineers today, you probably don't know a whole lot about P3. And so that was some of the other things I wanted to get. What can we glean? What's gone right? Maybe what do we need to fix going forward so we can roll this into the suite of project delivery methods on the immense amount of work that Congress has trusted us with. So John, I appreciate that, and we're going to keep you on speed dial here in the weeks and months ahead as we look to take the goodness of what you've achieved here and apply it elsewhere. And then the final point I wanted to make was that, please don't leave any doubt, we certainly recognize the importance of this particular project and what it means to this community. We all saw what happened here back in 2009. As I was sharing with the mayor earlier, I had a relative, some relatives living here in Fargo, and I remember I wasn't in this job at the time, I wasn't even in the Corps, but I remember what that did to his family and the amount of work, and it was an all-hands-on effort, and we remember. So we recognize the importance of this. And certainly our experience over the last year, we responded to 32 natural disasters, some wildfires, but mostly floods across the nation. We certainly understand the importance of this work. But really, to get down to the question Senator Hoeven is asking is, okay, where are we in the budget for this project going ahead? And that was one of the objectives I had today, was to kind of get a sense of that. Where do we need to be in our recommendations back to General Semonite, my boss, and then certainly back to Secretary James in moving this particular project forward. We've got, all these projects are hard, as Senator Hoeven said, but certainly I wanted to get a better understanding of where are we in adjudicating the comments, both from our environmental assessment and then the state environmental impact statement. I think we've got a good feel for that. We've got this intersection with the injunction right here in the court that we've got to pay attention to. We've got a permit action outstanding in the state of Minnesota that I was able to learn a little bit more about. We certainly have a contractor that we haven't terminated, but we've suspended work, but that comes along with a timeline associated with it. I've been through that scenario on a number of occasions in my past job, and I want to understand how that all intersected. And then just as John has been outlining the nuances of P3 and what all that means with funding decisions moving forward. So in short, we're going to, certainly how this works, some of you around the table know this, certainly Senator knows it, but others in the room may not. So the energy and water bill for 19 passed around the 21st of September. And in that, we have 60 days to formulate how we would like to invest that $2 billion. The $2 billion is money Congress appropriated to us above and beyond the presidential budget. So we've got to go back. We owe a report to Congress in 60 days. So that's on or about the 20th of November. And today is about day 24 or 25 of that process. So it's too early to give anyone in this room a figure. But I will say we recognize the importance. Certainly my staff is going to make the best case effort and put our best foot forward and seek the dollars that we need to keep this thing moving forward in a positive direction, and then also to inform the 20 budget, which we're also working on, and then the budgets in the out years after that. So that's not, the answer to the question you asked me. I think when we get to the 20th of November, I'll have a better response for you with a bit more detail as we work this with General Semonite, Secretary James, and then through the administration. But I'd be happy to take any questions.
Well, that is the answer that I asked. You said you're committed to getting the funding that we need for this project this year. That's exactly, I know until that number comes out, you can't publicly state the number, but I appreciate your commitment to seek that number. That's exactly what I was asking.
In general.
I know you can't say that number until the plan comes out, but we greatly appreciate and value your commitment and support to get it.
And we'd hate you to ruin the Thanksgiving dinner for the senator here, so we want him to have something to give thanks for.
Exactly. No, you know, I understand you can't say the number today, but your commitment to seek it is what we need, and we appreciate that greatly.
Is there any questions for the Major General? Okay. Well, I got to admit, I really appreciate you coming here. I know we all do appreciate you coming down here to get sort of a face-to-face.
Thank you.
And I feel really good about this. We'll be looking forward to news in November and working with you in the future. And we send you off with the best of wishes that everything goes smooth with your work and the rest of cleanup in Florida and those kinds of things. And again, I always appreciate you coming down here, Senator, Colonel. And our next meeting is October 25th, and I'm going to adjourn us. Thank you.
Can we do your usual customary, give them a round of applause?